Joe is the father of the Iditarod.
He loves dogs. He loves the race.
This is Joe Redington Sr.
2, 1, go!
And it's a go for Joe. There goes Joe Redington.
Joe Redington Sr. of Connect, father of the Iditarod.
He believed in the power of sled dogs and their magical nightfall ways, their ability to survive blizzards upon the Bering Sea and the temper tantrums of the Yukon. With their help, he saw northern lights and western sunsets. With their help, he climbed a mountain called McKinley and paraded down Pennsylvania Avenue. He listened to their howling and heard a raw symphony, their instinct, something to be harnessed. He understood the precision and power. In short, he understood himself.
Joe's tenacious. He may be a sled dog man, but I always said I think he has a little bulldog in him as well.
Tonight, the life of Joe Redington Sr., a fabled storybook along a trail called Iditarod. 1,100 miles of tall tales and truths from Anchorage to Nome, all of it home to the man behind the last great race. As an Oklahoma youngster, Joe had that train-robbing outlaw look. How could he help it?
He would look at me sort of puzzled sometimes. He said, my daddy walked on the right side of the law. He said, you know, I don't know how he got mixed up with all them damn outlaws.
Somebody said that they thought that his real mother might have been Belle Starr, the outlaw.
He just barely remembered his mother because he was only well, let's see, probably 5 or 6, I guess, when she left.
Abandoned by his mother, Redington was forced to hit the rails with his brother Ray and his father. A hasty decision.
They became wanderers because his father was afraid the civic ladies of the town were going to take the boys away from him.
So they rode the rails right into the Depression.
His dad was trying to get work wherever he could, and sometimes it was in the Northwest, sometimes it was in the Midwest, sometimes it was in the South.
But never Alaska. Joe only traveled there in old books.
Well, I'd always read a lot of Jack London stories about Alaska.
Alaska, where in London's words, huskies were running free in the open, the unpacked earth underfoot, the wide sky overhead, at last answering the call. A call Joe Redington couldn't ignore.
It was very much a turning point in his life, I think in 1948 when he made the move. He just woke up one day and said, I've always wanted to go to Alaska, and if I don't do it now, it's not going to happen.
We might as well told him we were going to the moon because people didn't know anything about Alaska like they do today.
They headed toward Wasilla, a town whose blueprint included
At one store, we had a bar, we had the roadhouse, we had a school, we had a library of a sort. I was one of 3 houses that had running water and a flush toilet.
May Carter was rural royalty, a United States territorial commissioner for the region.
We were the coroner, we were the justice of peace, we were the recorder.
Carter would be among the first Alaskans to greet Joe Redington.
When I first met him, he was so happy to be here. He was so happy to be here.
Redington quickly settled in a place called Knik, 13 miles outside of Wasilla. His sportsman skills were clearly evident, as was his flair for shaking up the status quo. You see, Redington's new wife, Vi, had also been married to Redington's brother, Ray. In fact, Vi had come up to Alaska with Ray. Her sibling swap, the shock of Wasilla.
I think it turned Wasilla upside down, I think.
It really did. We'd never had that happen before. Yeah, it was quite the talk of the town.
Redington was also drawing attention with his growing dog yard and what he was doing with them.
He used to go out where they'd have an airplane wreck and haul in a lot of the debris.
There was nobody else with teams of dogs, nearby, who could go into these, remote areas and help them salvage, bodies, actually, is part of what the story is there, as well as wreckage.
I thought, well, he's kind of an entrepreneur, making his own jobs.
But his biggest job awaited. One benefit, he wouldn't have to travel far.
I mean, there's a perfect irony that, and a symmetry to the fact that, and when they finally did find a place to settle, it was practically right on top of the Iditarod Trail.
The Iditarod Trail, a turn-of-the-century gold rush trail. At one time, more than 1,000 miners lived in Iditarod itself.
It's fascinating to get out to a place like Iditarod. And you can almost hear and feel the people that inhabited that place.
Iditarod represented another era, the golden era of dog mushing, when the All-Alaska Sweepstake race took place between Kendall and Nome, when Leonard Seppala and his dog team made headlines worldwide with their life-saving serum run to Nome in 1925. But by Joe Redington's time, the golden era of dog mushing had gone the way of gold towns. Iditarod and her trail were in neglect. Worse, a different breed of dog threatened to kill all mushers.
Iron Dog.
He's always hated snow machines, and especially when they called them iron dogs. He says they're not like a dog at all.
Comes the snow machines, and out go the dogs.
So something had to be done so that we'd still have sled dogs.
Through the years, Alaska has hosted a variety of dog mushing races, mostly the sprint variety. Mushers like Gareth Wright, who won both the 1950 North America and World Championships, were held in the highest regard.
In those days, we weren't just stars. I mean, we were sort of like gods,
But by the 1960s,
the sprint races were slowly coming to an end. No interest.
Snow machines were the new rage. Dog mushing seemed archaic, recreation for dinosaurs. Redington hated the machines, and he knew he had to do something radical.
He really was interested in getting some long-distance mushing started again.
There hadn't been a long-distance race in Alaska, as far as I know, since the All-Alaska Sweepstakes went out of business in 1917.
But of course, at that time, we weren't even thinking about Anchorage to Nome. It was just going to be a shorter race, maybe from Knik to Iditarod and back, or something like that.
But somebody had a grander plan. Just who is a matter of dispute.
There have been so many different tales of how it ended up here. It may be so colored in time that you may not ever get the true story.
Joe Redington claimed he came up with the idea of ditching the Knik to Iditarod route.
I remember Joe said, "No, boys," he says, "this isn't going to work." He says, we've got to do something big. This has got to be something that is unbelievable to start with. So I'm going to say we go to Nome, Anchorage to Nome.
But I don't recall Joe coming up with that.
Howard Farley claims Redington was in favor of the shorter route and that he talked Joe out of it.
And I said, "Joe, why do you want to run it out in the middle of nowhere?" Because I says, there's nobody at Iditarod. And I says, even if you could get a crowd there, I says, it wouldn't be much of a welcome or a send-off for anybody. So I had a lot to do with him bringing it. I said, bring it to Nome.
Regardless of who said it, all agreed Anchorage to Nome would be the route. The details were hatched at a place in downtown Anchorage, a place called the Warehouse.
I wasn't at the warehouse. I only heard the warehouse stories.
It was the time of the hippies, and it was, I think that's what they were.
The hippies hung out at the Warehouse. Naked, one woman dropped by as Joe spoke at an Iditarod meeting.
She got to be closer and closer to Joe's back, and we just kept watching her, and finally she said, "Hello." And Joe kind of got a start, and he turned around and he said, "Hello?"
And he'd come home and he'd say, boy, it kind of disrupts the meeting down there.
From such au natural beginnings, the last great race on Earth took shape. At the time, the idea was looked down upon.
I never did get in the backing of the Iditarod myself, personally. The Iditarod started out with all our rejects. I mean, the dogs that really would have been put out of their misery. To tell you the truth, I predicted that it would be out within, I figured 5 years. But, of course, Joe Redington was a tenacious person.
Redington believed in his 1,000-mile race so much, he offered an outrageous amount of prize money.
Joe came up with the $50,000 because Joe was always a big thinker.
$50,000 paychecks may be common these Iditarod days, but it was an unbelievable sum of money back in 1973.
We didn't think it would be any problem raising that amount of money for a race of this sort. But when we went to people and talked to them about it, they said, it's not possible. You just aren't going to do it.
Among the doubters, Dorothy Page, nicknamed the mother of the Iditarod. Page had long supported the trail and helped put together a centennial race there in 1967. But this latest race repulsed her.
Dorothy Page, you know, is called the mother of the Iditarod. Frankly, she had nothing to do with the first Iditarod race. We went to see her one night, and she wanted her hands washed clean of it because she thought it would be a big failure, and she didn't want her name associated with it.
He never expected it to be as difficult.
Redington needed help.
Joe's never been shy about enlisting help.
Dear Howard, I thought you might be interested in this race. Little did I know it'd be my life's work.
On December 9th, 1972, Redington wrote Howard Farley a letter now considered the Magna Carta of the Iditarod.
You could do a lot of good on the Nome Inn. Let me know how you feel on this as soon as you can. So long for now, Joe Sr.
Farley forwarded a copy of the letter to the Nome City Councilman, Leo Rasmussen.
You see that letter on the wall up there? That was my kiss of death.
Farley and Rasmussen would play key roles in the first Iditarod race. In a town full of gold mine dreams, they went along for the gamble.
We here in Nome have been known for doing things that are off the slippery edge of the earth anyway, see? And this definitely was off the slippery edge. There's no question about it.
We didn't have the money for the purse when that race started.
He said they got not a dime in the bank.
We weren't sure if we were going to jail or not. It's the truth of the matter.
I knew the money wasn't there when we left.
On March 3rd, 1973, 34 dog teams left for Nome. Conspicuously missing Joe Redington.
So we went to him in the hotel the night before the race and took him aside and said, Joe, you can't go. And it broke his heart, but we just had to have him there as a front man for us to try to collect the rest of the prize money before the mushers got to Nome.
He swore by God that when them mushers got to know him, if he had to sell his wife, Vi, he would have enough money to pay that race off.
While Redington scrambled to get prize money, the mushers took off in a state of bewilderment.
Joe says, no, he says, I'm not going in the race. I said, God, who's going to, I mean, we're a bunch of people jumping out in the middle of nowhere, and our leader isn't even going to be there to see us along.
In my own mind, I was thinking, well, here we got Joe essentially saying, boys, here's a compass. Be sure you got your snowshoes. We'll see you in Nome.
Women and children were at the starting line crying because they didn't know what was going to happen.
First year I lost 32 pounds from Anchorage to Nome because there's no trail sometimes.
Dave Olson, who tried to mark the Iditarod Trail for the race, put it best.
What in the hell am I doing here?
We actually had a little map, and this map was supposed to show us where the places to stay were. Well, we were going along, you know, and all of a sudden we say, well, we've gone 50 miles. I know we've gone 50 miles. There's no cabin. There's nothing. And we go, and we go, and we go, and we go, and then we stop and say, gee, I just can't go anymore. You get up the next morning, you go around the next bend, and there'd be the cabin.
While the mushers struggled on the ground, scheduled airdrops disappeared. One morning,
and there were no airplanes up, you know, the Iditarod Air Force wasn't on the job that day. We literally was organizing a moose hunt to go get dog food. About the time we got organized, then it started to clear, and pretty soon here came a plane, and we stomped out. I don't know if there are any pictures of that or not. It would have had to have been from the pilot's view, but we actually stomped out dog food in the snow.
Dick Wilmoth would eventually make it to Nome first. It would take him 20 days. There would be no stately burl arch for him to pass under. Instead,
one of our city employees, people were looking around, where's this finish line? Where's this going to end? And so forth. He ran over and bought a big can of red Kool-Aid, the powder. And he came out and he just poured it across the street.
as for the prize money,
in the end, the community did help them. I mean, bankers and businessmen did come through with enough money to make the purse a reality.
most of the purse. Dan Seavey, who finished third that year, was approached by Redington.
He came up to me very businesslike, and he says, Seavey, he says, got a little business proposition for you. And I said, oh, what you got in mind, Joe? And he said, well, and he kind of confidentially takes me aside and he said, we're going to end up short on the on the purse, and since you have a steady job, you're making all these teachers' wages. He said, how about a little loan so we can we can pull this thing off?
He didn't bat an eye. He just said, yes, use it. So, and of course, we did write him out a promissory note that he'd be paid sometime in the future.
About 4 or 5 years later, I finally got paid.
It would take the city of Nome 7 years to recover from their Iditarod debts, stuck with $50,000 worth of unpaid bills.
We, the Nome Kennel Club, the city of Nome, the citizens of Nome, probably deserve as much credit for saving the race as anywhere else, because those first 7 years, there isn't one of those vendors that couldn't have taken the race to court and closed it down.
But instead of litigation, celebration. Nome and the Iditarod were too good a match.
One of the best marriages ever made in Alaska.
Howard Farley would finish 20th that first year and never race the Iditarod again. No mind.
I ran the very first one. That's the one that counted.
Leo Rasmussen would eventually become an Iditarod trail president, forever touched by the first race.
Iditarod was one thing. It was the greatest happening on earth, and that was all you can say. It happened.
Gleo Hike and his friend Tom Johnson would slip into obscurity. While Redington is often hailed as the father of the Iditarod, he couldn't have done it without them.
Tom and I, we've often joked about it. Well, are we uncles of the Iditarod or sons of the father of the Iditarod? I don't expect to be remembered.
One man for the record books is John Schultz, who finished last in '73, winning the Red Lantern Award.
He'll always hold the record of the slowest Iditarod ever, 32 days. And we got him a poked gold worth $300. And they asked John when he got up and gave his interview, they said, John, well, what do you think about that? He says, I came all the way to Nome to get drunk, and he says, that's what I'm doing now. And I never seen John Schultz after that.
As for Joe Redington, he saw the future, telling the mushers,
I'll bet money that the day will come when this race will be run in 10 days or less. And we kind of, yeah, sure, Joe. But you see what has happened.
In the following years, the 10-day mark would be shattered, establishing Joe Redington as a folksy prophet. But not even Redington could foresee some of the Iditarod's greatest moments.
Maybe 4 feet behind Mackey. Here comes...
In 1978, 5 years after the first Iditarod race, the unthinkable happened.
Oh my God!
The drama on Front Street in Nome, after 1,000 to 1,100 miles, 2 dog teams and 2 mushers just sprinting down the street neck and neck like the 100-yard dash in the Olympics. It's just a vision nobody ever imagined.
We have Swenson, the team is pulling up almost neck and neck.
In a photo finish, Dick Mackey beat Rick Swenson, a controversial decision since Mackey himself had collapsed before crossing the finish line. No matter, his lead dog crossed first, sealing the victory. It was a moment that combined the Kentucky Derby with a heavyweight championship fight, a moment that put the Iditarod on the sporting world map.
I always made it exciting, from 1977, 78, my cards didn't quite play out right, but it was damn exciting.
In 1985, another eventful finish. This time, a woman. 28-year-old Libby Riddles became the first female to win the Iditarod. Her daring run into a fierce Bering Sea storm ensured her victory, forever breaking up the good old boys club. The Iditarod had a cover girl look, and the world took notice.
Libby Riddles was probably the finest thing that happened to us.
When I first won the race, I had no idea the impact of my win on the race. I know Joe really appreciated it because that's the Iditarod, that's his baby.
Funny thing out of that, shortly thereafter, there were T-shirts out. Men are in Alaska, men are men, and women win the Iditarod.
And this is your first time on the trail?
Yeah.
You gonna make it?
Oh yeah.
All right. Gonna give all these guys a run for the money, eh?
Yep.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
One woman in particular would reel off 3 straight victories. How could Susan Butcher fail? A certain odds maker had made her the favorite.
He said, Susan Butcher's going to win the Iditarod someday. And he says he knew it from the very first go.
Redington himself would never win the Iditarod. In 19 starts, his best showing was 3 fifth-place finishes.
I don't think Joe ever had the opportunity to train a dog team the way that myself or Martin Boozer or Jeff King or any of the top competitors today would feel was proper.
This is a man that the first year of the Iditarod, he was 55 years old. I mean, a time when most men would be looking forward to maybe retiring someday.
I used to joke with him out on the Iditarod Trail and say, hey, Joe, I'm getting too old for this. And he would just laugh, because here's this guy who didn't even start racing until he's like 57 or something,
I used to accuse him when he'd get into the checkpoints that he'd homestead at the checkpoints. He'd visit with everybody, and just stay. And he said, well, you have to visit with these people.
Everybody surrounded around him, welcomed him like he was a prodigal son that just came home.
For Redington, the victories came not in trophies, but in fan support. A turnout prompted in part by Redington's ceaseless promotion of the event.
We started referring to Joe as P.T. Barnum of Alaska, and that the race is going to be the greatest show on earth, by the time Joe gets through with it.
He's always the promoter. So he'd get a sponsor, and then he'd want me to shoot a photograph of whatever gizmo his sponsor gave him. I mean, I shot pictures of him in Alparod coats, with Beretta handguns, with everything under the sun, in hopes that his sponsor would like that.
Joe worked particularly hard for one sponsor.
When you run the Iditarod, you only run with the bare necessities.
A bright headlamp, snowshoes, a good sleeping bag, and about a dozen pair of warm socks.
You won't find any unnecessary gear in Joe Redington's sled, but you will find an ample supply of Tang. Tang, good hot or cold, and also available in convenient jars and pitcher-sized packets.
Tang was the greatest thing that had ever came to the Iditarod.
Joe got this one dog, and he was really, really orange. And he said, I'm going to name him Tang. But we took pictures with him kneeling with Tang for the Tang calendar. These are some of the pictures that I've taken of Joe in the 25 years that I knew him or so.
Bill Devine took many photos of Joe Redington. His most famous shot is Joe with his lead dog, Feets.
I used to be able to breathe backwards down deep in my throat and make it sound just like a puppy. Once a dog heard that, they turned their head to look, what is that?
Redington used such shots for promotional purposes, starting a series of mushing cards.
He's promoted, and he's promoted, and he has promoted. In fact, I am one of the few owners of a bottle of Joe Redington wine. It's a very sweet wine. A very sweet wine. I have 2 bottles. One's empty and one's full. I better not say any more about that.
It's 4:30 a.m., and while most Alaskans are working on their 3rd or 4th dream, Joe Redington is working on his 2nd cord of wood.
No promotion was too crazy for Joe. There were even Joe Redington dolls. Meanwhile, the real item walked around like a rugged billboard. One patch in particular.
I made the Iditarod insignia. Every picture you ever seen of Joe, he's got a patch on someplace, except when I took the picture of him when we were in Washington, D.C., and he was in a tuxedo. That was rented, and he didn't dare put it on.
The Iditarod had become a treasure house of goods. Redington cards, wine, and tang, in a way Madison Avenue could never imagine. An average Joe had turned an Alaskan path into a promotional gold mine. And now he turned his sights toward greater heights. In the Alaska Range towers Mount McKinley. At 20,320 feet, it is the tallest mountain in North America. In 1979, Joe Redington sized it up.
Well, here we go again.
You know, Joe was called Crazy Joe by a lot of people for good reason. Some of his ideas.
And the idea behind it of taking a dog team to the summit of Mount McKinley, I mean, people go, what?
That I didn't like. I mean, he wanted to do it so bad that I had to let him do it. He was always out to prove what those dogs could do. That's why he climbed Mount McKinley.
With a little help from friends.
It's a great cast of characters in itself. I mean, you've got Joe Redington, the founder of the Iditarod. You got Susan Butcher, who was going to win 4 Iditarods. And you've got Ray Janae, who was probably the most flamboyant guide in the history of Alaska, running up and down the mountain.
I mean, I was 23. So, I mean, this was just an incredible experience. We didn't go on to the mountain for any other reason than to make it. We didn't know how we were going to make it, and we didn't know how it would work out, but we were going to make it. So we made tons of errors, you know, and we just learned. And when Janae would come and check on us every once in a while, he would go, "You've been doing what?" You know, and we go, "Well."
Since 1932, over 80 climbers had died trying to reach the summit. Twice, Butcher and the dog team almost fell to their deaths at the 11,000-foot mark.
The sled had flipped, and I was just holding on, and the dogs were just tumbling down the mountain. And Tekla, my lead dog, guided our fall into Janae, and he caught us probably 10 feet from the first crevasse.
On Memorial Day 1979, the team reached the summit. The celebration quickly turned into chaos.
The top of the summit was a riot. Because, well, Joe and I had only thought about how to get up to the top of the summit. And we had never discussed going back down. We told this to Janae. And he starts screaming and stomping and waving his ice axe in the air and going, "We brought these dogs up here as a dog team. We're taking them down as a dog team." And he danced around so much he got a bloody nose, and he ended up whacking Joe by mistake with the ice axe.
And of course, Ray was kind of a volatile personality. He's hopping up and down on the summit, right? He's waving his arms. He's yelling. He said, "My father had hunting dogs back in Switzerland. He said when he told them to stop, they stopped." And Joe just looked at him in that soft little Oklahoma voice and said, "Well now, Ray, these here dogs are Iditarod dogs. They're taught to go, not to stop."
All this is absolutely true. We just had this big discussion. He said, "Can't you control these dogs?" And we're like, "No."
In the end, they were able to control the dogs enough to get back down. Out of all Susan Butcher's accomplishments, this one, no pun intended, is...
Oh, right up at the top. I mean, it was definitely one of the most wonderful things. And I think it was just so neat the way Joe and I did it.
For Susan Butcher and Joe Redington, it was just one of many adventures they would have off the Iditarod Trail.
Joe's flying adventures were certainly as up there with his mushing adventures. I mean, he had a plane crash with Susan Butcher.
I'm just sure we're going to die, and it doesn't look good to me. So I kind of tapped Joe on the shoulder. I was in the back seat, and Joe just turned around and said, "It's going to be okay." And I just had total faith. I just thought, oh, okay. Then I was kind of watching out the window, and I went, well, thank good to me.
Crashing planes was nothing new for Joe.
I mean, he couldn't even remember how many crashes he'd had.
I mean, he crashed a few times, but he always walked away from it. And they say that's a great landing if you can do that.
He also knew he had the ultimate survival tool.
And he always used to sort of grin, this little impish grin, and say, "It's the Joe Redington luck."
When people ask him how many dogs he had, he says, "Well, I don't know, but I can tell you how many acres of them."
They had over 500 dogs, I think. I mean, that's got to be a world record of some kind, even if nobody's keeping track. But
Howard Farley once tried to help Joe feed them, at night no less.
I don't know if we fed them all. I really don't know to this day. You'd look out in the trees and you shine a flashlight around and be all these eyes, you know.
Given the huge number of dogs Redington had, it was unnatural how he wanted to celebrate the country's bicentennial.
200 dogs, you can imagine what power.
200 sled dogs, a record team, pulling a bus down Knik Goose Bay Road.
And they just start pulling that bus. It didn't matter if they had brakes or not. You can imagine 20 dogs, 30 dogs, 40, 50, 200 dogs. They could have pulled half of Wasilla down to Knik.
Actually, there were 201 dogs pulling the bus, but it still counted as a bicentennial celebration, perhaps the most unique in 1976. 4 years later, Redington and friends would invade Washington, D.C.
We made up our minds when we got there that everybody would stay in furs, no matter how hot it got.
Pennsylvania Avenue had never seen anything like it.
They were very serious, you know, and here comes the crazy Alaskans and
bands and horses, and then it was when it changed to horses and bands, everybody had a bugle, drive a car, you know. It was same thing over and over. And then all of a sudden here come 3 dog teams down the middle of the street. It was great.
It almost didn't happen. Several days before the inaugural parade, while Redington and friends toured Washington, D.C.,
some young people, they stole a couple dogs from the yard. One is Joe Redington's leader, Feet.
Oh, that was Feets, was one of them. Feets, you see in the photograph.
Luckily, a tip led authorities to the dogs.
Hooray, hooray! And so we got them back in time to put in the parade.
Redington's brief spotlight in the nation's capital would eventually be replaced by an Olympic torch. As usual, the trip would have a unique twist to it.
Hallelujah!
1 minute to start.
In 1994, Joe Redington was invited to Norway to participate in the Winter Olympics. But before heading to Lillehammer, Joe trained in Sweden with a Swedish dog team, a team he would use during the Olympics. Right from the start, Joe realized something.
Joe was going to have to mush this team of dogs that were completely different and get used to them, and also they responded to Swedish commands.
If you wanted them to go fast, you can.
I'll just go.
Yeah, you also can say, okay, yeah, and kick at the same time. Yeah.
He's used to G and Ha, or right and left, and and this was Huyger and Fenster but he just couldn't do it. He'd just like clam up when, you know, the dogs had to turn, and he just completely clam up. He couldn't remember which. Finally he goes, "Nan, you gotta write them on my mitts." Finally he said, "How come these damn dogs can't learn English?"
Despite the language obstacles, Joe managed a third-place finish in one of the exhibition races.
He also lent this incredible air of distinction to the race because, as all the other mushers said to me, you know, that he was the most legendary in the world.
Congratulations.
And everybody knew about Joe Redington.
Okay, Mr. Redington, thank you very much for this. And I said it before, it's a pleasure to have you here.
By the 1990s, the world knew about Joe Redington, and people trusted him so much, they were willing to pay him $15,000 apiece to get them to Nome in an event called the Iditarod Challenge.
The rest of the state was going, that is completely nuts. People trained for years to do this. You know, he's going to take 6 people with 9-dog team. They're going to go over 2 mountain ranges up the frozen Yukon River, across the Bering Sea, and they're going to end up in Nome. They're going to die out there.
These people never, instead of put a foot on a dog sled in their life, other than petting a sled dog. That's as far as they've gone.
My first mushing experience was about 5 days ago.
They're going to die out there.
All the way to Nome, why, we just take it nice and easy and follow the Iditarod.
For Redington, that was hard advice to follow.
Joe, he would take his dog team and he'd hook up his dog team and go, and everybody was expected to follow or keep up. Well, he'd just go, he'd be at the next place before you know it, and some of the people on it, where's Joe? I mean, we don't see him all day long. We just see him at night at the camps, you know. And so we gotta have to talk with Joe and tell him to slow down, spend a little more time.
Everybody is looking good. 3 hours, we'll be in Nome.
It took 23 days for the first challenge group to get to Nome, but they all made it. Redington was right again.
There's Joe again in the forefront saying, let's take tourists along the trail. There's a demand for it. Well, nobody knew about that demand, you know, and it turned out that he was right.
I think Joe should have done it 20 years earlier. But Joe didn't want to get out of the race.
In 1997, at the age of 80, Joe Redington found himself at the starting line again.
I felt that being I started it and it lasted for 25 years, it must be a pretty good thing. So I decided I ought to be a part of it for the 25th anniversary.
Joe Redington is on his way to Nome.
And I asked Joe, I said, Joe, why are you running this thing? He said, well, I'm kind of making up for the fact that I didn't run the first one.
Joe Redington started the Silver Iditarod in the honorary #1 slot. At the age of 80, he would post his 3rd fastest time ever.
I'm glad that was his last race. Better that than a race where he struggled. And instead, he just had this brilliant race and he had a great time and he felt good the whole time.
Really, even at the age of 80, my God. Can you imagine somebody that you know, 80 years old, going 1,000 miles down the Iditarod Trail?
That age was irrelevant to him.
90% of the battle may be fought right up here, and that's where Joe was the toughest. He was the strongest, and somebody that just wasn't going to let a dream die.
Such doggedness, if you will, earned Redington respect and a sense of cautious wonder.
I don't know what made him so obsessed with sled dogs. And I don't know.
Just a great friend, and hard to figure out sometimes.
The difficulty lay in his one-track mind.
Joe clashed with everybody eventually.
Some of the crazy, the stupid, the irritatingest, the worst things that happened. Joe was a party to some of the things that just really rattled your bones.
If Joe had an idea for something and he wanted it done, he got it done. Didn't matter. And sometimes it didn't even matter if it was a good idea or not.
If he got an idea, it was Boy, we're going to do it. And that's the way it was at home, too. It will be this way.
I don't give in very easy on something that I think is right and something I think is good.
In 1995, he put on a commemorative serum run from Nenana to Nome. The race did not go well.
And we only have 4 teams running out of each village this year because there isn't the dogs anymore.
Redington insisted the relay go on despite 50 below weather.
They're breathing in a lot of cold air, you know, so you can't go very far, very fast is what it amounts to.
They're going to go out and we'll leave it up to their judgment whether they should camp and hold up or whether they should go on to Old Minto.
And that's where he was stubborn. He just did it his way, no matter what.
Native musher Mike Williams incurred Redington's wrath when he told him he could no longer afford to race the Iditarod.
And I told Joe, I'm paying my bills for the last 3 Iditarods, and I expended a lot of my resources to running the race, and I can't do it on fumes. I have to pay my bills and feed my family, and as soon as I pay my expenses out, I'm going to get back to it. That's my promise, Joe. I put that excuse in front of him. He said, Mike, I think it's a poor excuse.
Redington's biggest battles would be with the United States Humane Society.
Joe's way of dealing with that was, in Joe's words, to tell him to go to hell.
Redington would take out newspaper ads against the Humane Society,
basically condemning them for what they were doing, which was the same thing as inviting the skunk to dinner.
The ads backfired. Money started rolling in to the Humane Society.
Within 6 months, they had $1 million surplus in their account. And they can thank Iditarod.
Worse, big money sponsors pulled out of the race.
Adding even more fuel to the fire, Dodge Truck and ABC Sports just announced they aren't renewing their contracts with the Iditarod, and that amounts to about $200,000.
In today's day and age, it's necessary sometimes to not be so abrupt and deliberate in your actions.
Joe was wrong, but we survived.
He didn't know the word can't, truly he didn't.
Like they say, the man that thinks he can and the man that thinks he can't are probably both right.
When it came to the Iditarod Trail and Mount McKinley, Redington only knew the word can. But the word can't would soon become part of his vocabulary.
This next musher coming to the starting line really doesn't need any introduction.
Joe Redington had endured many injuries during his Iditarod career, but he never let on about the agony.
I mean, he would tell us stories about when he was going through Rainy Pass and it being 130 degrees below zero with the wind chill factor.
And the way I was shivering when I got in that sleeping bag, I kind of believe that it might have been.
No matter what the conditions were in each checkpoint, he said, boy, that feels good. That's how tough he was.
One of the toughest little guys I've ever known in my entire life. Just, I don't think he was much more than 5 feet tall.
Despite only standing 5'5", Redington was called the toughest man in Alaska by the Los Angeles Times. During the Iditarod Challenge Tours, he would tell many a campfire tale of how he earned the title.
He launches into this great story. When I was going over the banks of the Susitna River, and somebody had left a steel 55-gallon drum there with a spike sticking out of it. Well, I lost my balance, and that spike went right through my knee, and there was blood gushing everywhere. And I got to the other side of the river, and I had to take my bunny boots off and empty out the blood. And some guy comes running out, he goes, Joe, he said, we heard about your accident. He said, I'll take care of your dogs. You go inside, there's a nurse waiting for you. At this point in the story, Joe looks at all of us and he goes, a nurse. A goddamn nurse on the Iditarod Trail. And with that, He goes back to his sled, pulls the snow hook, takes off.
In late 1997, Redington would need a nurse, Joyce Garrison, to help him battle cancer.
And I told him that if he would not give up and go through all this hell he's going to go through, that I would stick with him all the way, and I did. The little nurse, too. He introduced everybody as the little nurse.
Garrison would take Redington on long walks near his home. Early on, he showed his spirit.
He was kind of bent over like this, you know, kind of shuffling. But when I told him, you know, you're really bent over, he'd really stand up straight.
And then he was good for a while. He lost all his hair, but then it all came back in, and nicer than ever. And we thought maybe he had it licked, you know, when that happened, but it came back as got into his lungs, I guess.
Over the years, Bill Devine had shot many pictures of Redington. In the spring of 1999, Joe stood by a family cabin.
That was the last day I took pictures. I realized that he was getting thin, and he wasn't the Joe Redington that everybody knew.
Joe Redington never used the word can't until cancer returned and gripped his throat.
Well, you couldn't do that with any other type of, I ain't got that right. You couldn't do that with, I ain't with a damn today for this for some reason. I've had too many things I've been thinking about.
Joe was surprised that cancer got him. You know, it wasn't something he was expecting. And that was one of the things that he said to me. You know, he said, I didn't think it was going to be this way, but he said, I think this one's got me.
Rick Swenson came down and spent hours with him.
Talking about old times and looking through photo albums. We ended up getting some of Joe's old gear out even, and looking at some stuff from back in the 70s and the 80s, you know, and reminiscing about those things.
Back in the 1970s, Susan Butcher spent many hours with Redington at his dog yard. And this is where she would say goodbye.
It was my last memory with Joe, so, you know, it's hard. So, went fast.
On June 24th, 1999, Joe Redington died, surrounded by family.
Every dog in the dog lot was in their house and didn't make a sound. For hours, it was like that. Hours and hours. And it was like they knew that the master had gone.
Okay.
And I adore the fact that he went in and he's buried in his sled with his park on and his boots on and his mitts and his hat and his headlamp. You know, he'll be lighting the way.
Redington rests, but moves eternally in famous pictures, like the one Jeff Schultz took of him in front of Mount McKinley.
And I call it the two great ones.
One remains, one is gone.
Because I was new to Alaska, he was, you know, just like a father figure. Because he taught me so much. Just different.
Redington is gone, but his dogs remain.
Ruby was Joe's favorite. She was a swing dog. And he always gave her extra food and the little tidbits, you know, the best meat. And so Ruby got treated a little special. She still does. You hungry?
These days, Joyce Garrison feeds the dogs. She now runs Joe's kennel. Her nursing days transformed.
Hey, Kirby. Joe is my best friend. We spent every day together for almost 2 years, and walking and talking and mushing dogs. The only thing he said he didn't get to do was take me to Nome. So I'm going to have to do that on my own, I hope.
The road to Nome is a trail called Iditarod. The road to Nome ends under a burl arch. Call it coincidence, but when Redington died, the burl arch gave way too.
I think the wood in it kind of deteriorated and rotted so bad that it just couldn't stand the weight anymore, and the upright legs on it kind of collapsed under it.
In pieces, the burl arch will soon be a plaque. The arch has fallen, Redington is gone, an era ended.
I miss him a lot now.
Redington is gone, but the curious still come. Bruce Bowler stops in from Juneau.
I've been a fan of Joe's for years since we moved up here in the 70s, and I've always wanted to see his place and see these beautiful, beautiful animals. I'm just kind of looking at the future of the sport here. This is just so exciting. You are just so beautiful.
Joe Redington may no longer hold the pups, but with Joyce Garrison's care, they'll grow, and some will run to Nome. Redington's race goes on.
My goal is to win the Iditarod next year and start out the millennium.
Redington is gone, but not those he taught.
He greatly admired Rick Swenson and predicted that he will win the 2000 race, as a matter of fact. So Joe says Rick's going to win this year.
Knowing Joe the way I do, that was Joe's way of giving me a little nudge to get out there and show these guys that I can still win the Iditarod.
Redington is gone, but Iditarod pioneers like Dan Seavey hold on to the souvenirs.
What we're looking at here is a real piece of Iditarod history. Some of the old timers will recognize that as the very first trail markers that were used.
Dan Seavey ran the first Iditarod, and he trains for another run. Not necessarily for first place or fame, but for family. In the 2001 Iditarod, Seavey, his son Mitch, and a grandson will head to Nome. Redington's race now spans generations.
Yeah, I'll see you up the line then. Anytime you can start something like that and get in debt $60,000, you got something pretty good going.
Joe Redington may no longer be able to tell his many stories, but Lou Friedman heard enough of them to write a book about the father of the Iditarod. Taking Joe's place at the book signings is his wife Vi. Appropriate, since the book really is about...
It's really a great love story.
You didn't see Vi, but you knew that she was back there, whether it was making sure that the dogs were getting taken care of back at home. She was always there behind him for all the years that I knew him, and whenever you went to Joe's house.
A regular junkyard.
And he was looking for something, you know, Vi would always know where the heck it was. If Joe didn't know, Vi would just, you know, he wouldn't even ask her. She'd just come along pretty soon, and there she'd have what it was that he was looking for. And
one time we were in there, you know, getting ready for one of the challenges, and Joe came in, and this whole pile of stuff, as he's on his way into the kitchen, just toppled over. And Vi looked at him and she said, "Joe?" And he said, "Well, Vi, there's just too much stuff here." And she looked at him and she said, "Your boots are too big."
Such stories are recounted in his book. Where he cannot sign, she does.
So he just fell in love, I guess.
Joe Redington's greatness is recounted in a book, but other legends he knew and loved continue to write their own stories of resilience. In a Shishmaref dog yard, the Cannonball takes stock.
She's gonna be my lead dog, this one.
Herbie Nayakpuk, the Shishmaref Cannonball, has plans for a comeback despite a heart attack and a stroke.
Well, someday, if I get my health back again, I'd like to get back on the race again.
If he does, Herbie says Joe will be by his side. Simple, really.
Because we're brothers.
Redington is gone, but the bond of bloodlines remains. And like all champions, the blood that runs through winners has an historical pulse.
But you know who he was, really? Joe was Leonard Seppala. A lot of people don't realize that. Joe was Leonard Seppala. They were about the same stature and stubborn. And do you know that Leonard Seppala's ashes are on the Iditarod Trail? Joe took him out there the first year. And to people that are steeped in history, there's a lot of significance to that.
Somewhere on the Iditarod Trail lies Seppala's ashes and Redington's guts. It's not a racetrack, but wilderness timing with the extraordinary.
Remember, this is not just a race now. This is legend.
I don't know. 1,049 miles is a lot.
Today, the youngsters hone their dog sled skills in daring Redington fashion. Someday, they too may be on the Iditarod Trail. And they'll have company. In the fall of 1999, Iditarod officials held their annual meeting, starting with roll call.
Rick Swenson.
Here.
Dick Westland. Joe Redington Sr.
Joe's absence is excused. He is on the trail.
If you would like to order a copy of Redington, the man behind the last great race, call toll-free 1-877-368-9672. The price for each video is $19.95 plus shipping and handling charges.